Hello everyone, this is Damon here with PixNub Software, and in this video I'll be discussing a set of PSD templates that I created that you can use in sports photo automation to create print sheets. So this just gives you another use for sports photo automation, and it doesn't have to be sports images, it can be anything. And this is for final images, so if you're doing composites, you do the composites first, but it doesn't have to be composites, it can be just regular, old masters muslin shots that you did for school images or something. It really doesn't matter. Now I recommend watching this entire video because although this is very easy to use, there's a couple things that you probably wouldn't know about if you don't watch this whole video, and so there's a couple pitfalls you need to be aware of. But let's just get started here. And so these work like any other sports photo automation template. Now I'm in the HTML panel here. But you can do this in batch the same as you would batch any other template. And these are all set with the player one image. So I'm just going to click replace image for player one. Then it's going to replace the image for all of the smart objects. So you see we now have a layout of 8 wallets on an 8x10. Now there is a layer for cut guides which is turned off by default. And if you want it on, turn that on. Now, if you're going to do batch, you'll need to turn that on, and you'll need to save the PSD with that on. So it's your choice whether to use it, but you'll need to turn it on and save it, or save the template, that is, before you run the batch. Now, you can make this any color. It really doesn't matter. However, I found that 50% gray in most cases allows you to see the line, and it's a very thin line when it prints. This is only 2 pixels, as you can see there, and I found that was the perfect size to be able to see, and then when you cut, you won't see it, especially if it's this 50% gray. It just usually goes away when you cut it. So make sure though to turn that on if you want it. Every file is going to have a layer that says do not hide or delete, and that means exactly what it says. Do not turn this off. And don't delete that. If you leave this unchecked, although you don't see any difference here, it will not work when you do the batch automation. And this contains the master smart object that sports photo automation is working with, which is then duplicated for all of the other smart objects. I'm not going to get into too much on the setup there, but let's just run a batch quick and so you can see this in action. So like I said, the batch will be done the exact same way. Let's see, do I have the right folder here? Yep, I've already done this once, so I'm in the right folder. And then you select your background the same way. No, I don't want to move that. It's in here. That is all you have to do. Now, if you're just wanting to do one print sheet per image, there's no need for a CSV. Now, you can create a CSV and do multiple print sheets in one run. It's completely up to you, but if you're just doing a couple, it's almost just as easy to run it multiple times. Let's just run this. And since it's not actually doing any composition building, this is very quick. On this computer, it usually takes me about 3 seconds an image. Although it's running 4 seconds an image here, I think that's because the screen recording software is probably slowing it down a bit. Okay, just about done. So let's go check out the images. Now you notice that these are all sideways because it's a portrait layout on the file. I purposely made all of these portrait layout instead of some landscape layout and some portrait layout, because just for printing consistency. But if you want them the other way, you can just rotate them. It's not going to make any difference on how it runs. So let me demonstrate that real quick because I think it's important to know. Okay, let's see here. All right, let's say this one Oh, another thing, I'll talk about that in a minute. Never mind. Let's just do this real quick. Let's do a build a single composition. Okay. So you see these are all in there correctly, but if you wanted to, for whatever reason, if you wanted your canvas like this, it's still going to work exactly the same. You're not going to need to do anything in the file, just rotate it and save it. And the reason why is because the smart object itself doesn't rotate when you rotate that, and everything just works. So easy enough. Now there are a few things, now like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there's a few pitfalls you need to be aware of. Now these are things that I think I could actually not necessarily fix because they're not broken, but it is something you need to be aware of when you do it. But I can make a better system if I built a print sheet section directly in Sports Photo Automation, which I may do. Depends on how well these sell, because if I think there's a lot of interest in this and it's worth my time, then I might spend a few weeks and build an actual print sheet system in here. So a few things that you need to be aware of is the first and the most obvious here. Let me open a file. Is there will be a folder of print sheets that's for portrait images and for landscape. Now, there's not as many landscapes. Typically, your images are going to be portrait when you're doing this. But in the example that you wanted team images in a 5:7 format, those are going to be landscape. If you tried to run this file and get an image here, it's not going to work correctly because it's looking for a landscape image. It's going to crop too much off. Let's go open the equivalent one in. Now you see the layout, I mean, looks the same, other than one says portrait and one says landscape and the text is rotated, but the dimensions of this are exactly the same as the other one, but this one is looking for a portrait image. Oh, I went too far again. All right. So just make sure you use the right one for the type of images you're running. Now, I could have a system built in to where it automatically determined if your image was landscape or portrait and rotate it if needed. Now, that obviously isn't needed when you're building sports compositions because you're never going to rotate the kid on his side to put in the template. It just doesn't make any sense to have that in the current sports photo automation system. But it does make sense to have that in the case of making print sheets, and that way you wouldn't need two different print sheets, one for landscape and one for portrait. One would just work for both. So that is something I'm thinking about for the future, possibly. So the next one that's going to be a little less obvious is there is a case where, or several of them actually, where there's different aspect ratios on the same templates. All right, so let me think here, which ones? Let's grab these two. So in this case, both of these are meant for portrait style images and the layouts look identical. But the difference is that one of these is meant for if you have 2:3 aspect ratio originals. So if you're using a full frame camera and you've not done any cropping, you would use this file. The next file is for if your images are 4:5, 3:4, or 5:7. So if you've already cropped it, or if you have a 4/3 camera and they're in portrait mode, you would use this file. So I'm just going to replace two images. It'll be easier to see the difference once I do that. Now, both of these are still going to fill the 5x7 and still fill the 3.5x5. So it's not going to give you any difference in the actual dimensions of the image, but if you watch closely, if I go one to the next, you see that this one is more zoomed in. So if you use the wrong one, and in this case our image was 8x10, so it was a 4x5, and this is the right file to use. If you use the wrong file in this case, it zooms in a little more, and it would probably be, well, actually it would be worse, I think, if they're for some of the templates that have 4x5s and the wallets mixed in there, but a 5x7 and a 3.5x5 are not too different in aspect ratio. But what this is actually doing, let's go to the correct one here, which is this one. In your prints, these contain all of the smart objects, which are actually a duplicate of the same smart object, because it's only replacing this smart object, this master one, and then these all get automatically replaced. So this one, it's going to replace the 5x7, and it's actually making a 5x7, or it's cropping it to fit 5x7 by 300 pixels an inch, or pixels per inch, excuse me. And then what it has to do to get the other aspect ratio is for the 3.5 by 5. Let me turn one off. It uses a vector mask. And you see if I disable that, it extends past the edge there. And so based on the size of your original images, to avoid cropping the top and the sides, there had to be different files made based on the size of the original image. Because if you look in the one that says the 2x3 original, so if you're using a full frame, you use this one. But in this case, it's the exact opposite. It sets the aspect ratio to the 3.5x5, but then it crops the 5x7. If we look at the image dimensions, remember the other one was 1500 by 2100. Well, this is 1500 by 2143 at 300 pixels an inch, or I did it again, pixels per inch. And so it sets the aspect ratio to the other one, although it sets the original size to the biggest image, so that way you get your full 300 pixels per inch. There was a lot of thought that went into this, and it was actually kind of a pain in the butt to set these ones up. Now this is something that can be dealt with in a scripting environment. So if I decide to build in the print sheet section 2 here, you would only need one. You wouldn't need these different files for the different sizes of originals, because what I could do in that case was set it up with 2 smart objects, one for each aspect ratio, and the system would know to take your image and size it one way for one and one way for the other, and that way there would be no need for these vector masks. So that's something I'm thinking about for the future. If these sell well, if I get, if I sell 100 copies of these or something, and I think there's interest in this, and it's worth my time to do that, then I would go in and build this system. So the last thing to talk about is print bleed. And I decided to not do anything about print bleed in these templates and let the users decide how they're going to handle that. And in most cases, you'll probably do nothing, and it'll be just fine. If you're sending to a print lab, or if you're using a hot folder printer device, it's going to crop a little bit off the edge. Now, in testing on my DMP printer on the 8x10s, I may lose 1/10 of an inch at the most on each side, probably a little bit less. But the one thing that can happen though, now this is with my DMP with the hot folder. So there's 2 situations. One where you are printing for a printer hot folder, or if you're sending to a lab, those are going to do the same thing. They're going to expand your print a little bit past the edges in order to not leave white space if it's not aligned perfectly. However, if you are printing from Photoshop, it's going to print the exact dimensions, or it's going to try to fit the image in the exact dimensions Photoshop is telling it, so it's not going to compensate for print bleed. So if I go to image size here. Now these are all set up as 8 by 10 at 300 pixels per inch. So you see 2400 by 3000 pixels, 8 by 10. Now for Photoshop, if you, like on my DMP printer for example, I'll get a very faint or small white border sometimes on one of the sides and the top or the bottom. If it's not perfectly aligned one way or the other, some of the ink will go off the edges on the top and one of the sides, or the bottom and the other side. To deal with that, you can go into your image sizing, and very important, uncheck resample, because if you leave the resample on, I'll just demonstrate both ways so you can see exactly what's happening. And in my case, I've only got to go like a few hundredths of an inch, and when I do that, it tries to print at past the borders a little bit, and then there is no white borders on my DMP printer. Yours might be a little different, and depending on if you got a different make or model of printer. But I found that 5/100ths works on my printer just fine, and I barely lose any edge that way, and I've got no white spacing. So I would save the file like this. Now the reason why I say uncheck the resample, because if you leave resample on and then you try to expand this, what's going to happen is it's going to actually change it. So you're no longer 2400 by 3000 pixels. You probably never notice the difference, quite honestly, in your prints. But if you do change this, what's going to happen is it's going to change the scaling on your smart object. Because I've got these set up so that way the largest photo in here is 300 ppi in the smart object itself, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so there's no reinterpolating, so the smart object is 100%. Now if you change that size, the smart object then upscales by maybe 1% or something. Probably never noticeable, but since I'm sort of OCD that way, I don't like resampling when I don't have to, so just anyway, it's enough talking about that. It doesn't really matter. Just leave it off and you're fine. The other thing, and for this file in particular, because I don't think I talked about this, is these sheets that have different aspect ratios. You don't see the print sizes on those like you do on the other ones. Let me just show you the difference here. I did it again, wrong folder. Oh, I've already got that file open that what did I do? Alright, let's close that and not save it. Okay. We'll get something to look at here, just be patient. Oh, I did. I went and saved that file. I'm a dummy. Okay, let me open a different one. Good thing I'm working on a copy and not the originals here. Okay. Alright, here we go. So we've got some mini wallets, and you see that we've got the image sizes right on each one. And if you don't see that extra layer at top that says hide, that's fine. That's going to get replaced in the smart object when it runs. Now for these here, the sizes are actually in a different folder, and it says hide for batch. So if you run that with this on, when it runs in batch, it's going to have the words above the images. So leave that off in batch. Now I had to do that because we're using the same object that's duplicated multiple times, and in order to have different text in each one, because this is a 3.5 by 5, this is a 5 by 7, I had to do that on a separate layer outside the smart object. And then there's also this instructions layer, and the only thing this is telling you, if you see one with instructions, it's just telling you which aspect ratio of original images, the images you're feeding into it, which aspect ratio to use, which is the same as in your file name here. I just put another spot in it, hoping that people would see it. And hopefully these sell well, and it will be worth my time investing in creating an entire print sheet system in here, because there's some really cool things if I did that. I can make it so, like I said, you wouldn't need different files for landscape and portrait images, because it would automatically be able to rotate. I would be able to have it handle it so in the cases where you had different aspect ratios in your images, you wouldn't have to worry about picking the right file for the source images, because I would be able to make two smart objects. I could make a smart object for the 5:7 aspect ratio and a smart object for the 3.5:5, and the system would then go in and replace both smart objects and resize appropriately. Now, the only way to do that now with the current system is with players 1 and 2 images, but then that would require a CSV. But if I reprogram this for the print sheet workflow, it could be done without a CSV and use two different smart objects. And then the other thing is with the print bleed, I think I could build in something that can automatically compensate for that with some settings. And then the last thing, which I think would be cool, is to have it to where you could group the different print sheets into a folder, and then you could tell it to run the batch on that folder of print sheets instead of just selecting one. That way you could pick, the 5 or 6 print sheets you wanted, and it could add the images to each one without needing to do it in a CSV file. So that's also something I think that'd be useful for the composition templates too, is to have a folder of templates that it can build compositions for, and it can do it for each template. It's in a folder. So those are some things to think about, but building something like this honestly would take several weeks to a month, and I don't know if the return on investment is there to do it, because putting that much time into it, I don't know how much extra I'd see or how many more copies of the program I'd sell. So I'm going to gauge that based on how many of these template sets sell. If I sell 100 of these, I'm going to say, wow, this is worth my time to go build this system in place. And the system, of course, would be able to be used with your own templates. So you could create your own print sheet layouts if you need something different than what I put out there. It would work for your own designs too. So something to consider for the future. So if you if you'd like to see that, help me out and go purchase these templates, because that's how I'm going to decide whether to do this or not. And I think I covered basically everything there is here. But anyway, thanks for watching, and if you're interested at all in sports photo automation or these print sheet layouts, please be sure to visit our website. That is pixnub.com. And also, these templates will be on All-Star Pix. That's going to be the main spot. They're sold once that website is up and running. But for now, there is a link in this video to where you can purchase these templates if you want them. Thank you.